And despite it all, I think we definitely have to be more willing to change. I feel like a lot of times when people are dealing with things or kind of hurting, they kind of don't realize that change, that pain that we go through, the suffering, is definitely needed to experience the peace after. It's needed to realize what we can persevere from. I feel like a lot of times it'd be easier if we realize that we've been able to get over every single object in life to the point we are today. And I feel like it's so much easier to kind of be negative about it and kind of feel like you can't grow from things, or that's impossible to grow from things, instead of accepting what's happened to you and accepting that you've been able to persevere. Accepting that you are consistent in that sense of actively learning how to heal from problems. And I feel like when we have these problems, and being able to understand what those problems are is already problem solving in a sense. I feel like if people actively wanted to heal from things, they would realize this. Instead of like procrastinating everything and hurting themselves, it's a lot easier. So when we do have these problems and we're able to address it and we're able to understand what's actively hurting us, we've already solved half of the problem. I feel like if we're able to realize what's harming us and how we can move on from it, we take those steps, and in turn we start to help ourselves. And I feel like a lot of times that's definitely what it means to actively grow, to actively improve in life. I feel like those people who are very self-aware or can kind of self-realize the things that are kind of happening in their life are the people that allow themselves to grow the most. You definitely have to be more aware and more accustomed to the things around you. I feel like people should definitely take more time to kind of realize their own emotion, and I feel like when you are growing in your own emotion and being able to communicate and effectively tell people how you're feeling, you're able to understand it so much better. If we actively want to be a better partner, not only for other people, but for ourselves, we'd realize this. We'd be more effective in this sense to understanding how people might feel about certain things, or how perceptions might cloud our judgment with other things. I feel like a lot of times people don't really take that work into account. They definitely don't try to understand things when we are having these conversations, and that's why it's so harmful. We definitely have to realize that. I feel like nowadays people who have these conversations are so much more stuck on kind of winning the argument rather than actually growing, rather than actually taking into account what's being said. And I think that definitely has to deal with pride and ego, but I feel like that's a whole another thing that you can kind of branch off into. When people are too prideful in a sense and have too much of an ego to tell people how they feel, they kind of harm themselves from even experiencing those good things. When you're not able to lower your walls, you have to realize that nothing good can enter those walls either. When you're protecting yourself from bad, you're cutting off your chances of experiencing the good. And I think that's what a lot of people don't realize. That good can definitely be something that we're actually wanting, we're actually looking for. I don't think a lot of people realize that we're harming ourselves when we do keep up those walls, so high and kind of so over the radar, that we're cutting things off. We're cutting things off with other people and ourselves. And when people are building these really high walls to not get hurt, they have to realize that the good things also can't get over those walls because we're so scared of being hurt. The fear of being perceived, the fear of being hurt by someone else is not allowing us to experiencing the good things with people. The good people that come into our life, we can often dismiss because we're so scarred, because we're so stuck in our self-sabotaging ways that we don't realize that we're actively harming ourselves. We have to realize that good things can happen to us. We are lovable. I feel like so many people kind of talk their own self ways and kind of talk down on themselves and say that they're not able to do certain things because of how someone treated them in the past, or because of how someone treated them in the past now determines their worth now. We have to realize that we determine our worth now, everything that we amount to, because there's no one that will ever be able to understand and experience every single thing you've experienced, not now and not ever. I feel like it's definitely up to you to determine not only your worth, but your standards, the things you allow and the people you allow in your life. You can have those walls up to protect yourself, but I feel like it's ignorant to not allow yourself to be open to change, to be open to these better experiences. Building these walls is definitely one thing, but having the walls and being in control of everything that you can control is what's most important. And I think that change is the hardest to experience, when we are kind of lost in a sense and not really realizing what's around us. We're so open to being hurt, and we're so open to also miss those good things. I feel like that good thing is really what's the hardest about it. I feel like self-sabotage and kind of changing our ways is the change that we need. When you tell yourself you can't change, you can't. And I think that's really the hardest part about it, is changing in a way that's not only productive, but the best for you, the most ideal for your situation. And I think so many people don't realize that. So many people are so stuck on this idea that they can't do something, or that their past is now, the receipt to how much they owe, or the receipt to how much they're worth, And really it's not. You know, it can definitely be guiding principles and can kind of tell you a lot about someone, how they expect this experience or how they can kind of move on from it. But I feel like if they use that merely to kind of determine themselves or solely to determine themselves, it's negative. You know, it's definitely harmful. You know, that willingness to change is definitely something more people need. I feel like when people are kind of meeting each other and kind of experiencing things, and then months go by and they come back, or months go by, years go by, and nothing seems to change, we have to realize that those people are closed-minded. You know, those people aren't looking for a relationship. And I feel like a lot of people don't realize what it means to look for a relationship. You know, I feel like we're forever going to be looking if we have that love in our heart, but we have to realize that a relationship comes with more than just having someone with you all the time, with talking to someone all the time. You know, it comes with sacrifice, and more than that, it comes with vulnerability and change. And I feel like that vulnerability and change part is where so many people don't fall into line. You know, where so many people don't want to conform to it because they're so scared or they're so worried about every single thing around them. You know, if we're not open to that change, if we're not open to sacrificing ourselves and being selfless in a sense to talk to our partner, to support our partner, to be there for our partner, then ultimately we're not ready for a relationship. And I feel like there is no rule book or no boxes you can check to say, yes, I'm doing this, yes, I'm able to do this. It's more of a feeling, and it's more of an innate desire to be there for someone. I feel like not a lot of people realize what they're actively doing until they get out of the relationship, you know, the actual faults that they have. And some people will never realize that, you know, and those are the people that are so closed off to that change. You know, I feel like the biggest part about healing that so many people kind of shun away from and don't really talk about is the accepting of your faults in it. You know, in healing, what did you do? You know, you have to take accountability in a sense, not saying that it's always your fault or to have this victim mentality, but it is best to realize you did play a role in this change. You know, you did play a role in how things went about. And each time we look at it, that's definitely what it means to actively heal. You know, we can't heal unless we take all the baggage with us. You know, if you're cleaning a house and you only pick up some things because they're smaller things or the bigger things and leave other things in the house will still be dirty. You know, the house will still be in the same way dirty, just with less things to visit, you know, just with less things to see. And I feel like that visibility, then that being able to see all the trash in your house is what's most important. And I feel like so many people are blinded to it. You know, so many people, whether it's outside validation or friends or even social media kind of telling them that they don't have to do this or they can do their own thing or have their own this, we have to realize that everyone's life is different. And with that, everyone's relationship is different. You know, we definitely have to find our own rules and our own things that are better than just listening to some TikTok rules, than listening to someone else's perceptions or someone else's, these are my rules and how relationships work, and if you don't like it, you can get out. You know, I feel like that's ignorant. You know, we have to find our own productivity in a sense, you know, with how we allow people to talk to us, with how we allow certain relationships to happen. I feel like that's really the best part. You know, that's the best thing you can say about it. That's the best thing we can experience. You know, if we truly do want better relationships, we'd be better at changing. We'd be better at understanding the things around us and being open to experiencing that growth. That growth is the part that I feel like so many people are shying away from. If we want to experience good things, be able to grow. You know, be able to change, be able to have this willingness, this open-mindedness to realize that you're not always going to be right. You're not always going to feel the same way about certain things in your life. And that's just growing. You know, that's just changing. I feel like if every few months, every few years, if you can look back at yourself and realize that there's an amount of change or realize that there's something different about you, there's a new way you're doing this, we're living. We're being productive, and we're not only being better for ourselves, but we're being better for our partner or future partner, and so on. You know, and I feel like that's the most important thing about that. Be able to grow within yourself to help the people without yourself. You know, without other people, without these other experiencing, none of it matters. Be able to change.